welcome to the Remembering Akron podcast. I'm your host, Derek Maxfield, and today my guest is Bill Paxon. Welcome, Bill.
It's good to be here, Derek.
Actually, your proper name is Leon, I just learned, though, right?
It is original. It is Leon William. It is, and I've never gone by that. I've always gone by L. William.
But you could be the fourth.
Yes, that would be really awful. I do not like that, But yeah, my dad was Leon, always called Leon by his family, and his father, Leon also, and then my great-grandfather was William Leon. They switched it. It's another story, but...
Wow, all right.
Yeah.
So you were born 65 years ago in Buffalo, New York, but lived most of your life in Akron.
Always. My parents were here, we had married. My mother came from the city. My father lived here. They got married. They lived on Main Street in an apartment. And then I came along, and shortly thereafter, they moved out on Crittenden Road, where I lived with them until I was 25.
All right. Well, tell me about your parents, since you mentioned them, Leon and Mary.
Sure. Leon Paxon, my dad, who died in 1997, December of 97, he was literally born here in Akron at a house down on Cedar Street. He was had put himself through University of Buffalo in the 30s by working in the gypsum mines out on Bloomingdale Road. And he became a lawyer, had a practice here in town, small-town lawyer. And then World War II came along. He went off. He was in the Army Air Corps, went off to the war. When he came back, I believe, and I'm not sure exactly the timing, but he was elected town supervisor either right when he got back or before he got back. There was a primary. The incumbent Republican town supervisor named Henry Dye, whose name is still on the insurance agency that Dante Marconi owns here in town. But Mr. Dye had cast a deciding vote for a sales tax. And a lot of the Republicans were unhappy with him, so they supported my dad.
I see.
So my dad became the town supervisor, and back then, that's two jobs. You were here in the town, overseeing the town board, and you go into the county, where the board of supervisors met. One supervisor for each town, and then the city was divided into wards. And sure enough, lo and behold, there goes my father off. By then my dad was in his late 30s, never married, goes off to the county board, and who do you meet? Mary Patricia Sellers, who had come home from the war. She'd been in the Navy, had just, like in 1943 or 4, turned of age. I don't know if it was 18 or 20 at that time. I think it was 18. She went off. She joined the Navy. So She went down to Washington, worked in what was just opened, the Pentagon, for, I think, 6 months, and the war was over. She came back, got the job up there. That's where they met, and he married her, and the rest is history. So that was my dad's background. Up till then, they got married. Shortly thereafter, about 2 years later, I came along, and that year was notable for him. He was elected county judge of the Children's Court. Oh. So my dad, all my life, I knew him when he was a judge. He was first Children's Court, then the Family Court in Erie County. And I got my love of politics through my parents.
Honestly.
Yeah. Honestly, absolutely.
But that must have been stressful, family court.
My father had a tough job, and I never appreciated it.
Yeah.
When I was at Canisius College, where you taught, or maybe still do. You mentioned
not now,
but
I have.
You have. Yep. I was at college, and there was the New York State Assembly did a study on this. It was a seminal work on the relationship between child abuse and later juvenile delinquency. And they hired a bunch of several of us who wouldn't, it's a good patronage job for the summer working for the court, and you go up. And so I got to go up there and do this. I had no idea of anything to do with the court system, including the family court, of which my father was one of the authors of the Family Court Act in New York. He never talked about it.
Wow.
The only thing he ever talked about, Fridays he'd come home, he was always in a good mood. It was the day he did adoptions. It was very uplifting. But we spent the summer, there's another judge's son and I, two young women, going through the records. So we had to go back through the court records and find cases from 16, 18 years earlier of child abuse and neglect. Then go ahead and see, did they end up becoming part of the criminal justice system as juvenile delinquents? It became a nationally famous study. However, for me, it was a shock. The first day opening those records and reading these stories of these horrific cases of child abuse and neglect of young children, you can't, you maybe can, because we talk more about it today, back then you didn't. And realizing that that's what my father did all day, every day. And I think Nancy Eckerson's here with us, and she knew my dad, and you wouldn't suspect, here's this very quiet, reserved, always smoked a pipe guy. The things that they have to do in those courts with and for children was stunning. So I was shocked. I was literally shocked. And I will tell you when the shock hit most, when I opened a file, and it was from this town, someone I knew.
Wow.
And to this day, I think how, it's unbelievable what people do to their children. And sadly, what becomes of many of the children from years. So anyway, that's what my dad did. And in spite of that, kept a great positive attitude toward life and was a well-loved guy here in town and a regular guy. My dad loved to hunt and fish. Kelsey Webster, who had been a town supervisor, they were best friends, served on the school board together. I didn't mention early on when my dad was in college, he and Kelsey ran for the school board. They were on that together. But you know, a real love of this community, small town America, and love the place.
That's a great story. Now tell me about your mom.
So my mother came from a very gregarious Irish Catholic family in North Buffalo, the kind of family where they kept half a keg of beer on the back porch, and every parish priest in the neighborhood in North Buffalo would come over, and they were singing and telling old Irish stories. And so it was quite a change for Leon W. Paxon to marry Mary Patricia Sellers. And I can tell you the families were about as different as you could imagine. And my mother was several things about her. She was as Catholic as can be, 100%. Got an award from the Pope, one of the highest church awards for her service to the Catholic Church.
Wow.
And devoted to the church and taught Sunday school all over the diocese, was on all these. She was very political. So she got involved with something. She became the president of the Council of Catholic Women for the diocese. And she was chair of the Genesee County chapter because for a while we went to church in Corfu, so she was involved there. And same with the Republican Party. My dad was the candidate, but my mother ran the campaigns, and she was a state committee woman for the Republican Party. Very, very, very active. Quick story. So I always loved two stories. I love politics. Ever since I can remember, it's all I wanted to do was run for office. You can tell I love to talk, so I make a good politician.
Go right ahead.
One story, and I can't remember exactly if Nancy's father was on the list, but I was 8 or 9 years old, and they had the industrial fair at the high school. You know how every year they'd have Perry's and Whiting's and all the Main Street business, they'd have this thing. And the Newstead Republican Party had a booth, and they had a name your town official. And they had the list of all 20, you know, who's on the zoning board of appeals, the planning board, town board, judges, whatever. They had blanks, and you filled out the names. Well, I was, I think, 8 or 9 years old, and I filled this out, and I put it in. In the Akron Herald, a couple weeks later, they had the winner of the contest, me. I named them all, and they had runners-up. Now, I can't tell you, I can't remember exactly who, but it was a number of the town officials' spouses were runners-up, or I don't think the officials could be in, but it was the spouses or other highly notable names in Akron who didn't do as well as little Billy Paxon. That's the way they said. They just said Billy Paxon won the award. So ever since I was very young, I loved the political world. Ben DeYoung, who was the town Republican chairman, great guy, farmer, Dandy Farms Country Club founder, along with my godfather, Ben DeYoung, or Eddie Mattioli, Len Daniels. Ben, there was a county legislative seat that encompassed Newstead, went over to Lancaster, down to Elma and Merle, Wales, Alden. So anyway, there was an opening in the county legislature, and the Republican Party wanted to hold this seat. Well, I wanted to run. I was 22, and I looked like I was about 12. And I went to Ben down at his house on Cedar Street and said, Ben, I talked to my parents, of course, and I've been involved in the party in these towns planning the eventual opportunity to run because the guy who was there, Norm Wolf, was going to run for judge someday. So anyway, my dad said, well, you better go down and talk to Ben about this. So Ben, off I trounced down Cedar Street, 2 in the afternoon, and Ben's sitting there, and he said, Billy, come on in, sit down. We sit at the kitchen table, and Ben said, now Ben came to town, his father was right here, Methodist Church. His father came, was from Michigan, I think, or someplace. Somewhere they came, they were recruited to come here. Ben was his son, opened the tractor dealership. So Ben says, you want to run for the county legislature, huh? He reached behind him and he pulled out a bottle of whiskey and he put it on the table. Now, I had never had any hard liquor. I was in college, so I had beer, but I wasn't much of a drinker at the time. And Ben poured 2 glasses of whiskey, about 4 fingers of whiskey, and he pushed it across the table, and he said, let's just think about this a minute. And so he started drinking, looking at the ceiling. I said, well, I better do this. So I had a little whiskey, and I was passing out. You can imagine their first taste of whiskey. So we got done with that. He said, yep, I think you ought to go over to Elma and see Earl Lexo, who was had been the town supervisor. His son then was the supervisor at the time, but old Earl was a legendary guy who had served in the county board of supervisors with my father. So I go over a few days later to see old Earl W. Lexo, and he was a whizzing guy. Billy, come in, sit down. Ben called me and told me you want to run. Let's talk about this. He reaches out and pours gets some glasses out and 4 more fingers of whiskey. I'm thinking, oh my God, by the time I get to this job, I'm going to have cirrhosis. So, we have the drink, talk about this, and he sends me out to Wales to meet Norm Ryman. Now, the good news was Norm didn't pour me a drink, but ultimately, because of Ben and the local Republican Party that was so supportive of me, they got me started in my political career.
Nice.
And I went on, so followed my dad and mother off to County Hall.
Wow. And your stories there just got us way ahead on the interview. So
I'm sorry.
I
apologize.
No, that's great. That means I don't have to lead you. You led yourself down that path. I would like to back up, though, and talk about Canisius just a little bit before we get to your congressional career.
Sure.
So I know that Canisius is a really remarkable place, and I'm just wondering if you have fond memories and if you feel like this gave you an important start.
There's no question. Look, I'm blessed. Totally, completely blessed by my family. And today's the day. We're now doing this interview in September. We buried my mother's ashes today at the little cemetery on Crittenden Road, just up from where I grew up. We had the funeral back at McAndrews Funeral Home here in town when she passed away this summer. But I'm blessed by my parents and my family and generations that came before me that, kept and maintained a great name for this family. I don't know what I've done, but, family, community, this community that supported our family over all these years in so many ways. I'm a third generation. My grandmother, Ruby Paxon, was a librarian in her later years, earlier, marched for the women's right to vote,
nice.
And then became the first woman tax collector in the town of Newstead. This is like right after women's suffrage, so in the 20s.
Wow.
So we've been blessed by that. I was blessed by a great education. I went to Akron School through 8th grade. Absolutely blessed by that school, and that I got out of that school is amazing because I'm not the best student. I found out much later what ADHD is when I found out our daughters had, ADHD. It's me. I have no attention span. It's amazing I got out of school. But Akron School, Akron community, and the third leg of that, to me, that got me where I am today is the Catholic Church. My mother, as I say, my dad and grandmother, everyone in our family, Paxons, went here to the First United Methodist Church. My mother came from Buffalo, and she said many times to my father different things, but he always knew when to stop. She said, Leon, the boys have to, I shouldn't hit the table, the boys have to go to St. Joe's. That's in Kenmore, Catholic school. Why? She goes, because the Pope said so. Nancy laughs. She knew my father. You put the pipe in, that's it. He's not going to argue with the Pope. There's no winning on that score. So off we went to St. Joe's. Oh, let me turn off my phone. I apologize. It's my daughter calling. So we went in 25 miles each way every day to St. Joe's, and it was a great experience for me. Really, really wonderful. It got me into quite an exciting world, and the Christian brothers who run the school are political in their own way, helped me along. They were very supportive, in spite of my lack of ability on the education side, very supportive of encouraging me in my political world. And then from there to Canisius. As you may know, Canisius College is really the place to go if you want to be in politics in certainly Erie County. When I served in Congress, all three members of Congress, John LaFalce, Hank Nowak, and I, all had gone to Canisius. Mayor Tony Masiello had gone to Canisius, several of the state senators. It was just a place. It was the local school, and if you went there, it helped you in your political career. And there's nothing wrong with UB. My dad went there. Nothing wrong with Buff State, Erie community. But for me, that was an important step for me to go there. And I enjoyed it. Great school. But my focus was always on running for office. And when I was a senior at Canisius was when I first announced to run for the county legislature. Another story.
Okay.
Didn't get to I know I'm getting ahead, but I forget them. If I don't tell it, I won't remember it.
Go right ahead.
When I told the story about Ben and running for the Republican endorsement, I had an obstacle, and the obstacle was our county executive at the time, Ned Regan, and our county Republican chairman didn't want me to run because I looked like I was 12. And they didn't want to lose the seat, and they were desperate to hold on to it so they would keep control of the county legislature. So I'm running around, and they keep moving the endorsement meeting later and later because they're trying to find somebody else to run to get me out of the picture. One day I called Chairman McKinnon. He was also the county park commissioner. I said, Mr. Chairman, I'm out here, and the Democrats already have a candidate, and he's out campaigning, and we need to get going. I really just am calling to encourage you, please, let's get this endorsement meeting of all these towns, and let's get this going. He said, Billy, you'll be a great candidate someday, but I talked to Ned Regan, and we have another candidate in mind. And I said, well, Mr. Chairman, who's that? There's nobody else here running. He goes, yeah. He goes, I just talked to her. It's your mother. I said, what? I'm living at home still on Crittenden Road. My parents, my mother. What do you mean? He goes, well, I called her today and asked her if she'd be willing to run. He said, well, what did she say? He said, well, I think she's thinking about it. So, of course, I hung up the phone, dialed up Mom at home. I said, Mom, Chairman McKinnon just says you're going to run for the county legislature. I'm running. She goes, oh, I know that. I didn't tell him I was going to run for the legislature. Of course I'll support you. So I called him back, and I said, Mr. Chairman, I just talked to my mom, and she's not going to run. But even if she does, there's going to be a primary because I'm running. He said, oh, well, so ultimately she didn't run. I ran. If she'd have run, she would have won. She would have been in the Congress long ago.
That's a great story. So you were a political science major at Canisius before you moved on.
I am.
And immediately into politics. Can you talk a little bit about the era and the atmosphere when you first got into politics? Because that would have been in the back in the
70s. I first ran for office in 77, but I grew up in it. I was, as I say, when you live on Crittenden Road, it was my brother Bob and I, and around the kind of political world that we grew up in, it was very respectful. My dad would always say, if you can't shake hands with your opponent and have a beer with him afterwards, you're taking this personally. It's kind of like we kid about my wife grew up on the street in Staten Island, New York, where the Godfather movie was filmed. And, we'd say, from everything is in the Godfather. Some line in there, the line about, this isn't personal, it's business. Well, it's the same in politics. You can't take it personally. If I did, I'd be a bitter man because, I was attacked every day by both the Buffalo and Rochester papers. It would be horrible. But I think that's somewhat of the difference. It's so much harsher, and it is, in my judgment, not the people who run. It's the media that covers it, that wants to have CNN and all these 24 hours a day conflicts, talking. All they do is have panels of people arguing with each other. There is no middle ground. Everybody goes to their corners. And the social media today is brutal. As we were chatting before we went on with the podcast, that I did 1,130 town meetings during my time in Congress. I did them also in the county legislature in the state. I enjoyed it. Come here to the Newstead Town Hall or the Akron Village Hall, roll up your sleeves, people come in, stand up, and have at you, and you have a good discussion. People learn from the discussion, from each other, neighbor talking, neighbors, and what have you. Today, unfortunately, the social media drives that wedge between people, and everybody kind of goes to their corners. If you're a conservative, you listen to Fox. If you're a liberal, you listen to MSNBC. It's just, I think that's sad and it's unfortunate, and I don't miss that part of it. I enjoyed every day in public office, but that part of it is sad for the country.
It is, and I don't blame you for that. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the change from serving locally to serving nationally. That must have been kind of a big jump. You were in the state assembly for a while.
Yeah.
How long were you in the state assembly?
So I was county 5, state 6, 10 in Congress.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so what was that jump like for you?
Well, it was a jump, although not as big as you might imagine. Even though the district, so when I was in the county legislature, there were like 50,000 people in a district, 6 towns. Then in the state assembly, I think I had 13. I was Erie and Wyoming County, part of Erie and Wyoming, and 120,000. You go to Congress, it's 500,000 people. So and plus you're going to Washington and back. Now it's 750,000 people in a congressional district. But, I liked the representative side of it. Some people like to run for county executive or town supervisor or an administrative job. I like the legislative job because it does require you to work across the aisle, to work with other people. You're never going to pass a bill on your own. You've got to have other people involved in part of the effort. So I enjoyed that more. I learned a lot as I went up the political ladder. I think it was very helpful to serve in the county legislature. And actually, in some ways, it's a harder job when you're a town councilman or a town supervisor or the village mayor. I always said when I was in my day, Don Whiting, who they own Whiting Roll-Up Doors, Don was the mayor, Kelsey Webster was the supervisor. They were here. They went to church here in this building. They went to school in this town. They knew everybody on every street, and everybody would get a hold of you. Boy, nobody held back. And as you went up the ladder, people were a little more reticent many times to call you or confront you. I remember when I lived at home it had been a one-room schoolhouse up on Crittenden Road that just before my parents bought it, it had been converted by Franklin Nice into being a regular home with several more than one room. I living over there, when I was in the county legislature, people would call at 2 a.m. to say, somebody from Holland, from Wales, in my district then, that part of my district, saying, my road's not being plowed. I got to milk the cows tonight, in the middle of the night. Get a plow up here. So I'd call the highway barn in East Aurora and say you haven't plowed so-and-so road. People wouldn't be afraid of that. When you get to Congress, I always kept my phone number in the book. I very rarely ever got a phone call at home when I had my phone number in the book and served in the U.S. Congress. I did in the county, and more often than not in the state legislature.
Mm-hmm. What year did you first start in Congress?
So I was elected to Congress in 1988. In a very contentious race. Jack Kemp had been my predecessor, famous Buffalo Bills quarterback, and probably one of the most famous Republican members of Congress in generations. He ran for president, didn't run for re-election, so I ran for his seat. Very contentious behind-the-scenes battle for that nomination of the Republican Party, and then had a very tough race. One of the most targeted races in the country in 1988 against a guy from Elma, Dave Swartz, who and the Democrats and Republicans both poured a ton of money in this race, and I won narrowly the first time.
In 1988.
Yep.
So George Bush was elected president in that year.
Yep.
And he would be there for 4 years. And then the Clinton years started very shortly thereafter. That must have been quite the change in tone in Congress.
Well, it was a change for a number of reasons. First of all, I had been elected and then reelected in 1990, a little wider margin, but still a contentious election. In 92, it was important for me for a number of reasons. First was the districts were redrawn because of every 10 years redistricting. And suddenly I picked up a much better, politically better district. I lost towns in Erie County like West Seneca and Hamburg, which were trending Democratic. And I picked up Wayne County, Cayuga County, Seneca County, way out to the east toward Auburn, very Republican areas. So number one, politically, it was a nirvana for me. Secondly, in 1992, there was a job in the Republican leadership in the Congress called chairman of the National Republican Congressional Committee, and what that is there's 7 elected leaders in each party, and in ours, that's one of the 7 elected leaders elected by the members. I ran for that job, and I was elected. So it was my job, after 40 years that the Republicans had been in the minority in the House, 40 years, since the year I was born was the last time they had had the majority. My job was to elect the Republican majority. And of course, you mentioned President Clinton. He had just been elected, beat George Bush. It was very unusual. First time since the Civil War that a party lost the White House, but we gained seats in the House, which was a good sign to me that we could maybe have a chance to win the majority. And sure enough, in 1993, President Clinton gave us gifts that I couldn't imagine. They passed a tax increase by 1 vote. All Democrats voted for it, no Republicans. And he and then First Lady Hillary Clinton were pushing Clinton health care. So we called it socialized medicine, but they pushed it. And they pushed gun control legislation through the Democratic-controlled House. These were enormously important for us on the Republican side. We recruited candidates, we raised money. Most importantly, then in November of 1994, first time, as I say, 40 years since the year I was born, we won the majority, and I was the campaign chairman. So it was a great experience. You know, we immediately took control, not immediately, but in January, took control of the House and proceeded under then our new Speaker, Newt Gingrich, to enact a lot of what we promised over the years we would do.
Now, working with Newt Gingrich must have been an interesting experience. He's an eccentric man.
It was a fascinating experience. He is a brilliant man. He's a college professor, an idea a minute. He saw the chance for us to win the majority long before anybody on the Republican side saw it. He really was the engineer of a lot of the framework from under which we ran philosophically, issue-wise, policy-wise. But then Once we got control, it wasn't quite the same because he was infamous for, a new idea a minute. Trying to change the direction of a legislative party every minute is impossible. And after about a year, we did the 100 days, first 100 days, contract with America, passed a lot of very sweeping reforms, welfare reform that I'd been pushing for from my time in the county legislature, tax relief, rebuilding our military. We did a lot of great things, but we did them. We did a lot of them in a way that caused a lot of whiplash amongst our membership. And you probably remember, but there was then a couple of years later. I should say back Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton gets a lot of credit for the things we did. He gets credit for a growing economy. It was our economic policies that turned the direction of the economy. He got credit for signing, we passed welfare reform 4 times, the same bill, until he finally realized he's losing on this, and he signed it. He'd like to take credit. We did it. Same with military. But by the time we won re-election, I was still chairman of the campaign committee in '96. We held the majority, which was it was a 5-seat then. We lost seats. We came down within 5 seats. Very, very tough race. And then our members, Republican members of the House, many of them, decided that they needed a new speaker. They picked the wrong candidate, me. I said I didn't want to do it, but it resulted in the speaker then. By then, I wasn't campaign chairman anymore. My term had ended on that job, but I still was in the leadership. They drummed me out of the leadership, and I became it was quite a fight. It became a pitched battle, very high profile. Books have been written about it. I won't bore you with it because it's ancient history, but the bottom line was I did what I wanted to do for the 4 years in the campaign chairman role. We enacted the legislation that I think was important, and even more important than any of that, during that time, I met and married my wife, who was also a congresswoman from New York City, Susan Molinari, also a third generation, just like I am, politician. Her grandfather and her father preceded her in the Congress, went on to become a legendary president of Staten Island Borough president. And I met Susan. She took his place in 1990. He had moved to run for borough president, so she took his seat, and we met. And just like my parents met in the Erie County Board of Supervisors, I met my wife in the Congress. So
the halls of Congress.
That's it. Yeah.
That's great. Now, you must have sat through the impeachment then.
I did. It was my last vote in Congress, the impeachment of Bill Clinton.
Wow.
The last day, the last votes.
So what was that atmosphere like sitting in on the...
Well, a bunch of things happened that day. The impeachment of Bill Clinton, which was unbelievable in terms of history and sitting there and going through all that. We'd been through it as a party. Some of us were enthusiastic and some not enthusiastic about following that route. But that occurred that day. Also that day was a day in which, because right after the election, Newt Gingrich announced he wasn't going to stay as speaker because there were a lot of the members who just were done wanted him gone. A guy named Bob Livingston had then, in the interregnum, after the election and before that last day of votes, had secured the votes of the members to become this incoming speaker. He got up that morning and announced he wasn't going to be speaker anymore because he had had an affair.
I remember that. Yeah.
So we had another change in leadership going on the floor. And it was an emotional day all the way around and of high drama. And by then, Susan had left Congress. Susan had left a year before, I think about a year before, to go to CBS News to establish a Saturday morning news program for CBS. So she wasn't in Congress any longer. But one other small bit of history, we were there was only been, up to that point, 2 other congressional couples had ever been, 2 sets of people had been married in Congress, neither of whom at that time were still married. So the track record of members of Congress marrying wasn't good, but in our case, 25 years this year, it's been great.
Oh, congratulations.
But we also had, up to that point and since, the only child born to 2 members of Congress. Our older daughter, Susan Ruby Paxon, named after Susan's grandmother was Susan. And my grandmother, Ruby Paxon, right here in Akron, New York, librarian, 107 years old.
Wow.
We named our daughter after our 2 grandmothers. And Subi, as we call her at home, Susan Ruby Subi, became and is still the first. I always say, I get in trouble. She won't, if she hears this, she'll scream. The only child born of 2 members of Congress that anybody can talk about. Isn't that awful? She just hates it. You can understand why a 23-year-old would say, "You're not my father. Don't talk to me." But then we had a second daughter who, while I was still in Congress, I left on January 1st of 19, or January 1st, 2nd, whatever the last day of the session was, of 1999. Katie, our younger daughter, was born 29th of January. So she just missed out on being the second child born in Congress of 2 members. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. There's any one of thousands of things you can do as a parent to embarrass your children.
Yeah.
I do most of them.
Okay. So why did you retire from Congress?
Well, I loved it. And I think I actually, there's small, blessings in disguise. The whole thing with Newt Gingrich, who I still have great respect for, disagreed entirely with him on my career there. But, getting thrown out of the leadership ended up being a big thing. And then there was talk that I was going to run against him by then. So I gave it 6 months of campaigning and thinking about it. But I decided not to. I enjoyed all of it, but I realized during that whole thing that finally led me to decide not to run for speaker, which I look back, I probably would have ended up being speaker. I'm more of the political animal. I love the campaigns. I loved it going back to my childhood here in Akron, where I put up signs for Kelsey and Percy Ball and Tom Habernack and all our town officials. I love that, and I love the campaign, and I loved putting a party in a position where it can then carry out its agenda, which was what it was about for me, winning the majority in the Congress. It wasn't just winning the majority, it was to do the things we talked about for 40 years. And I realized if I wasn't going to run for speaker, which I decided, Susan and I talked about, I decided it just wasn't a good thing to do when you have a brand new child at home. You want to have another one. And I'm going to be on the road 360 days a year. This is not a secret for success in marriage or raising children.
And a high-profile target for the media.
And a high-profile target. And I was, interesting sidelight, my father was 40 when he got married. My mother was 12 years younger than my dad. But my father was 40, and he was 42 and 44 when I was born, and then my brother Bob was born. I was the same age. I was 40 when I got married, 42 when by then, our older daughter was born. And we went on then shortly thereafter to have Katie. And I just realized, you know what? I don't begrudge my father's age. He was a great father. But you know what? In this day and age, it's probably not the smartest thing to raise children, be on the road, going all the time. I waited till I was 40 to get married. I want to have a successful marriage. So I decided, good time. But I also came to believe in term limits, which I had always toyed with and said I thought of. I do believe in term limits. I think that there is a time, and the average member of Congress at that point, and I still think today it's probably pretty close, serve about 10 years. And some leave by the ballot box, some leave by the wooden box, some leave because they realize I put it all in, and it's time now, and rather than just hanging around checking the box. And I just didn't want to be I'd been in leadership for 5-6 years. I didn't want to go back to being a backbencher and starting, through whatever track it is I wanted to be on. So it was a great experience, and I enjoyed it. 21 years in public office. Couldn't ask for a better career there. One last comment. I then went and looked around for a job. Ended up going to work at a law firm, Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld. Bob Strauss, one of the great legendary politicians in modern American history, been Democratic chairman under Lyndon Johnson. He ran McGovern's campaign. He was became a bipartisan guy. George H.W. Bush, ambassador to Moscow, when Russia was falling apart. So Bob Strauss is a legendary guy, and I went in to interview and talk with him about working at the firm. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I was going to be a lobbyist. I knew that's at that point probably what I wanted to do. And I talked to him, and we sat down, we chatted, and I said, "Well, I'm, you probably know some of my background." I said, I went through this whole thing with Gingrich, and he says, "Bob, I won't use." He was very colorful language, but he said, "Well, you're a damn fool." I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Don't apologize for that. Hell, if you hadn't had that fight with Gingrich, you wouldn't have been in the newspaper. I wouldn't have known who the hell you were." He said, "You just be some other congressman walking out the door." He said, "I followed your career before that and after, and I realized that the way you handled yourself through that time, that you could be a really good addition to our firm." And I served there for 19 years as a lobbyist. Represented a lot of interests in upstate New York, the Rochester Bus Company, the Niagara Frontier Transportation Authority, all the colleges and universities in the state, the SUNY system. I was there, I and our firm were the lobbyists for. So I enjoyed it. It was a great experience.
And you retired from there?
I did. I retired. I set a goal. Again, going back to the whole question of Congress, the term limits. I realized that I could see it when I was campaign chairman. The first 2 years, you pour everything in, and every day is a glass half empty, or glass half full. The second 2 years was half every day. You poured so much into it, and now you're starting to see the downsides of things. And I realized that with lobbying too. I said, you know what? There's going to be a timeline on this. And I'd been there a couple of years, and they came to me and asked me would I be willing to renegotiate my contract, and I said yes, I would, and we did, and it was for 15 years. So I'd been there 4 years. Nobody had ever had a 15-year contract in Washington, and my lawyer who represented me said they'll never go along with this. I said they will. I think they will, and they did. And it got halfway through or close down. The firm came to me and said, "Bill, this is ridiculous. You have this. You're not gonna retire when you're 64 years old." I said, "Yes, I am, because if I do this job right, by the time I get to that point, there's not going to be anything left. I'm going to be tired. I'm going to be cynical. I want to see an end point. I want to be able to say I'm working to that point. That's just the way I am. Some people are different. Some people can continue to I just knew that was what it was going to be. I don't know if I've ever told that story before about my contract, but the fact was that it was the right thing. And by the way, since then, just before I left, they've now instituted mandatory 65 retirement, not only at the firm I was with, but at most major law firms.
Wow. Because
they realize to generate new degree of energy in these firms, you need to bring young people in. And not just I was in the lobbying section, but they have 800 lawyers around the world.
Wow.
And the way to generate new enthusiasm, new energy, is to put people on a timeline and then take that, move it back down, and regenerate the firm. So it was a great experience. I loved every minute of it. I never wanted to be a lawyer. My father, when I was growing up, always wanted me, like he was, to go to UB, go to law school. And he'd always say, "Billy, you really ought to think of law school." I said, "Dad, let's drop this subject." I was lucky to get out of college. But when I ran for the county legislature, he said, "If you lose, you can go to law school." That was like a red flag in front of him. I race harder, run harder. When I was in the state or even in Congress, he said, "You can always hang it up and go to law school." So that kept me out of the law business for sure.
Yes. So what do you do with your time these days?
Well, I still am involved in Republican politics, and I enjoy it. I've done it all my life. I love every minute of it. And so we still maintain a residence in Washington. Our Susan Ruby, our oldest daughter, is taken in the family tradition. She is actually working at a lobbying firm now. And So we're still divided. Most of our time I live in Florida. We do. And Susan has just retired from a career with Google. 7 years she was running their government affairs. So she just retired in June. So she's going to continue to do some boards and some other activities. And I'm going to, as I say, I'm the full-time concierge for my wife and daughters. But I do other things in addition to Republican politics. We live in Sarasota, Florida. I've gotten involved in some philanthropy activities there, some Catholic Church activities, but most importantly, some Republican Party activities. And I have the misfortune of being president of our condominium association, and it makes county, state, and federal look easy.
Wow. So is there a book out there somewhere that you're going to write?
No, sir. No, after... When I went I went through the whole Gingrich thing and all the, winning the majority, holding it, all that, in the Clinton years, people talked about a book. My wife ended up writing one. So she wrote a book about her experience because she went from CBS, did a number of other things in between, and then ended up at Google. So she wrote a book years ago. But no, I have no interest in writing a book. Read them all, but don't write any of them.
All right. Well, we're almost out of time, and I'm going to end with the traditional last question I give to everybody, which they have found the most difficult of all, I think. So I want you to imagine a couple generations from now, maybe your great-grandchildren, and, late in life, one of your children is telling a story about you. What would you hope they would say?
I think the most important thing, that I was a good husband and father or grandfather, if I should ever get there. We waited a long time to have children, and now they're not in any hurry. Our oldest daughter is 23, youngest daughter is 20 at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She wants to go to law school. But I would hope that I'm a good husband and father. I love fatherhood. It has been a greatest experience. And one that, as I say, kind of tracked my own father's timeline. And I think in my case, it was great. I wouldn't have been a good father when I was in my 20s, like many of my friends who were good fathers at that age, but they started younger. I waited. I had to get the political bug out of me, and that's what I hope. And I also hope that they understand the history of this great town that I've lived in. I still consider myself an Akron, Newstead citizen. This is the most wonderful place to be raised with such a great history, and I'm so thrilled that you all are working to maintain that history.
And on that note, we want to thank you so much for joining us, Bill. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening in, and remember to tune in to the next episode of Remembering Akron.